On Between the Buried and Me's third studio album, Alaska, released in 2005, the progressive metal band wrote a song aptly titled Selkies, The Endless Obsession. Though the lyrics of the song do not appear to relate to its title, the title alone speaks to what this podcast is essentially about. Aloha, I'm Dan, and I've been obsessed, no hyperbole intended, with the Celtic shape-shifting seal folklore since I was introduced to it almost 20 years ago. Of course, I have been exposed to a variety of folklore and fairy tales since childhood, and mermaids were often in the forefront of that awareness. I have early memories of repeatedly listening to a Hans Christian Andersen cassette tape as a young kid, and The Little Mermaid tale was a personal favorite of that collection. Seeing the Disney animated version with my dad is one of my earliest movie theater memories, and still remains my favorite Disney animation film. As similar as selkies and mermaids may be on the surface, pun intended, as far as I am consciously aware, I was never exposed to the existence of selkie lore growing up. Perhaps I heard it mentioned here and there, but without context, it didn't stick. But then along came my friend Chris, the most well-read person I've ever known. As you'll hear in our upcoming conversation, Chris not only exposed me to this related, but remarkably different than mermaid lore while we were in college in the early 2000s, but it also sparked something in me that I hadn't previously known was there. I've been a huge fan, follower, and collector of popular forms of media my whole life. As a kid, Star Wars, Star Trek, He-Man, Ninja Turtles, just to name a few. In middle school, my interest in music exploded. In high school and college, I started fashioning myself a film buff and also a literary fan. I collected toys, comics, books, cassettes, VHS tapes, CDs, DVDs, and later, countless digital files across the board. I have felt strongly attached to many, many properties and franchises over the years. But through all that, I don't know if I'd say I was ever obsessed with any of them. At least not in the way Selkies has taken me over. Once Chris introduced me to this somewhat lesser-known branch of fairy folklore, it ignited a dire need to know, discover, and collect Selkie-related output. And just when I think I've consumed all that's available, something new or previously unknown grabs my attention. A recent example that couldn't have been more timely was when a friend, aware of my obsession, recommended a song to me by the newer, Netherlands-based Celtic metal band Blackbriar, whom I hadn't previously ever heard of. That song is the theme music of this show. Can you guess what the song title is? But back to the originally mentioned song. Having connected with other like-minded Selkie fans over the years, the Between the Buried and Me song title has proven to encompass not just the intense passion that comes with an interest like this, but also the endless nature of it. It's a fire that does not seem to ever burn out. It just blazes forward, ever growing and evolving. And that's what led me to finally creating this podcast. As you'll hear in my conversation with Chris, I've explored many ways of attempting to contribute to the awareness and evolution of this lore since learning about it. But until now, nothing is stuck. Sure, it's just a personal interest. I could absolutely enjoy it from the outside like I do with other stories and universes I follow. But there's something different, something more, something soul-reaching about this. Ever since discovering Selkies, I've felt the distinct urge, the compulsion, to not just experience it, but be a part of it. Because it's a part of me. It speaks to something innate in me, and I think safely, guess it does to many others as well, being that it's been around and evolving since before recorded history. I think what that is the human need to tell stories and feel part of a story. After all, aren't we the heroes of our own life stories? Struggling to overcome challenges as we follow our sometimes chosen, sometimes given paths? With setbacks and successes along the way, we see our experiences, our hopes, our dreams, our feelings mirrored in the stories of others, whether real or fictional. In the end, learning about others through fiction and non-fiction stories helps us learn about ourselves, doesn't it? And as we experience others' stories, some of us are compelled to craft our own. To me, all mediums of art and expression are just different means to tell our stories. Some choose the written word, others spoken. Some choose a canvas. Some take to the digital realm, others to film, video, or audio production, or combinations of all those, and so much more. What truly fascinates me about Selkie lore as a microcosm of this part of the human condition, beyond the familiar, commonly told stories that have been passed down through generations, is how this lore is just one of the countless examples of how lore and stories change and evolve over time, and cultural shifts, mediums, and technology growth. Though I intend this podcast to be a sort of library or repository, if you will, about all I've discovered, and hopefully will continue to, about existing Selkie lore, I also want to explore how it's changed and evolved over time in history. Though Selkies will both be the starting point and returning point of this podcast, I don't intend to only focus on that. I also want to use Selkies and this platform as a jumping off point to explore the broader implications that I've been discovering about storytelling, human expression, creativity, and myself since first becoming a fan of media and stories, and especially how the introduction of Selkies not only ramped my fanboy nature up to 11, but also took it down a completely unexpected path of both creative and self-discovery. There's so much more I want to dive into, but I have a whole open-ended podcast for that. So to get things started, let's jump into my conversation with Chris about both of our starting points with Selkies. Chris.
Hey.
Hey, I am so excited to be doing this with you. This has been, more than 15 years in the making of getting to this point of feeling like I need to create something for posterity about this thing that you started all these years ago with Selkies. And it's changed my life. I would not be the same person I am now, and have the same kind of mindset about things and curiosity about like fantasy and culture and folklore and the intersection of all those things, were it not for this short story that you wrote in college. But before we get to that, I want to just give a quick history and some context for what is going on here. So you and I met in high school in Pasadena, Maryland.
Pasadena.
I think we knew each other, but we weren't in actual classes together until junior year. Does that sound right?
We might have been in, for some reason I feel like I was in the same, we might have been in the same ninth grade English class, but I don't think we really knew each other then.
Okay. I think our most formative year together, our foundation of our friendship moving forward was our AP English senior year experience. Am I correct? Do you think that sounds right?
Yeah.
Because you and I were in AP English together, which was run by an awesome teacher that we had that was very young. I think she was 24, and she was so relatable and cool and fun, and she let us do a lot of creative writing. And didn't both of us had signed up for a creative writing class that was canceled, right?
I think so. Yeah.
And I think we connected over that too, because you and I both wanted to be creative writers at that point, and I think that was our kind of first bonded over that idea. And then and we were both bummed about not being able to be in that class, so we moved. But we were lucky that our English teacher, AP English teacher, allowed us to explore a lot of that creative writing stuff in spite of the AP curriculum that she was supposed to be sticking to. I remember that was a point of contention with some students that were calling her out on not preparing us well for the test or something, and then most people did fine anyway.
I love that. A month before, she was like, well, let's actually start doing the concrete studying for this exam.
Right.
And then when we got the break during the actual exam, we all ran into her classroom and told her how we were doing.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
She
was really good.
I think so there was that class, and then there was the fact that you and I were both taking a half day at school so we could take a community college class in the afternoon, right?
Yep.
And I had a car and you did not. So I gave
you a ride.
And you didn't bum a ride. I was more than happy to have company on the way. And and I think that year was a big year for us exploring music together. You started coming to shows with me and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it definitely got me out of my shell on being social and exploring the music scene.
And that was great. Just unforgettable memories of that whole period and how much fun that was, experiencing all this stuff with you. And then both of us with the intentions of being creative writers, we both went off to our own respective schools. I started at Hunter College in New York, and I was going to get into the creative writing program. And you went where?
Washington College on the Eastern Shore.
And you studied creative writing as well?
Yep.
Right.
English and creative writing.
we kept in touch, and we would share writing and stories and stuff back and forth. I ended up transferring to the University of the Arts in Philadelphia to study screenwriting, which for me I think was a much better choice. And when it comes to creative writing, because I am I feel a very inexperienced and poor prose writer. So the lack of language and how much the visual nature of screenwriting and how much is implied through minimal language was a plus for me, because I could still write and tell stories but not have to worry about the language as much. You, on the other hand, are, in my humble opinion, you are a brilliant writer with a very distinct voice that comes through, through the use of like a lot of really diverse language techniques. And I've always been inspired by what you're able to do, and how you're able to think and reflect on your writing.
Unearned.
Oh no, not at all. I disagree 100%. So, but that leads us to the inception of this whole journey. Is sometime, I don't remember. Do you remember which year? Was it sophomore, junior year? I think one of those where you wrote.
I think it was sophomore or junior year. I don't remember which, honestly.
For one of your creative writing classes, you chose to write a short story about, it was called Finboy, and it was about a modernized telling of the classic selkie tale, where there's repression and angst and lack of self-actualization because of this thing inside that it wasn't able to be, was being controlled by an outside force, and was and being manipulated, and but was still going to come out no matter what. And so yeah, you wrote that story, and I think we were just casually sharing stuff at the time back and forth, and you had sent me that, and it blew my mind. But I'd like you to take us back for a second, because my journey begins with your journey, and I don't know if I've ever actually asked you where you discovered Selkie folklore and why you chose to use it for that story. I'm sorry, this is a multi-part question. So if you could take us through like how you first discovered this folklore, why you chose to use it for this assignment, and also I think one of the biggest curiosities to me, and that's been the most profound part to me, is why you decided to not just like tell it in the way that I'm assuming that you first heard it, which is the classic, like pre-industrial revolution, Irish fisherman or Scottish fisher village kind of scenario, where they, that they find a Selkie woman bathing on shore and steal her skin, and that's like your typical Selkie story. I'm curious why you took that and modernized it and gave it a different spin, where you made it a mother-son story instead of a romance and tragic lost love kind of story. So if you could take us through that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So honestly, I don't remember where I probably first heard Selkie myths from. I mean, as a kid, I read a lot of like fairy tale anthologies and myth anthologies. So I assume I probably came across it somewhere in one of those books, like when I was in elementary or middle school, maybe, and it probably just kind of stuck in my brain. And then when I was and honestly, I still don't remember exactly what spurred that idea when I sat down to do the story assignment in school, whether like what I was thinking about that day. A part of me feels like I can't remember if my time frame gets skewed, and I can't remember if at the time I had bought a paperback of Hans Christian Andersen's stories, which includes the Little Mermaid,
right?
And whether I was kind of if I remembered Selkie myths from going back to that,
Hmm.
story or not. But then when I just sat down and wrote it, I also do remember when I was in college, I was semi-regularly going to the campus swimming pool and kind of re-teaching myself to swim again because I never had a pool regularly as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
it was just kind of fun to go back in and realize that I still had kind of at least an innate aptitude to be able to keep myself back and forth in the pool. So I think it also, I guess maybe those two ideas kind of coalesced, and I guess that's where the story came from, maybe. And just the modernization aspect. I mean, that just came from reading a lot of fantasy writers at that time, like Neil Gaiman, um, and others who were taking fantasy and myth and bringing it into the everyday modern day world that we live in.
Awesome. And, you said a couple of things. Like I assume that a lot of people discover. I don't have any quantifiable data on this, but the mermaid is so ubiquitous in modern consciousness and
Mhm.
myth and legend. Uh, uh, just the kind of common knowledge that I'm sure that that's a gateway for a lot of people is being interested in mermaids and then digging further into like other cultures versions of mermaids or what have you. um I love how you took your own kind of like experience at the time and put it in there. Because by the way, I don't think I mentioned this yet, but I urge anybody that is listening to read Chris's story. I'm sure he's very gracious to allow us to post something that he wrote. How long has it been now? Maybe like 17 years, 15,
Yeah,
16
17,
years,
18 years.
something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, and I'm sure you're not feeling like it's your best work or anything. And but I also I think for any artist, when you put stuff out, you're you're gonna reflect back on it later in like, oh geez, I wish I could have done this or that different. But that it's just, to me, art when it comes out is a snapshot of where you were and what was going on at the time.
Right. You
So
learn and grow.
it's but I mean, I'm not trying to preface this with like, oh, expect a not a good story or not good writing, because Chris has been an exceptional writer ever since I've known him and before, I'm sure. So I urge anybody to read, because we're talking kind of big picture about the story, which is essentially a teenage boy, right, who
Mhm.
is under the iron fist of his controlling single mother, but more so than typical boys, because he has a deep obsession and almost what, like, addiction to water,
Yep.
and
Being in
so
water.
being in water, and she's terrified of this, and he also has fins between, or I'm sorry, webbing between his
Webby, yeah.
fingers and toes, so she knows that there's something more with him, and he is not aware of that yet, right? He discovers that later, why he is that way.
Right, right. And I never, like, looking back, I was looking back on the story last night. It's only like, I think maybe 6.5 pages or 7 pages.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I was struck by the fact that I just plopped like on the first page. And oh, he has webbed fingers and toes, and it just,
Mm-hmm.
he's bullied for it and
Yeah, he's a
such.
social
That
outcast,
mhm.
and so essentially, so he discovers the truth at some point, and then he goes to, even though his mother has made his life very difficult, he also has deep compassion and empathy for the pain and trauma that she experienced having a sulky husband that abandoned the family, right? So
Yeah, but like if I ever went back to it, I think I made the mother more sympathetic than I think I remembered it. But I might want to,
mhm,
if I ever went back to it, I'd probably want to do things more from her side as well. Just because basically,
mhm,
yeah, she basically hooks up with a guy, and he jets and leaves her with as a single mom,
yeah.
and he's just like, blah blah blah, prophecy, blah blah blah.
So that, and I think it really there's so many little aspects, that we can get into, but there's that that inspired me and struck me from your story. But um the fact that he does find compassion for his mother even after everything that she put him through because of her, projected trauma and defenses about her experience with her ex-lover. That the story kind of ends with him going to seek revenge on the father, right?
Yep.
So
Vengeance with a harpoon.
maim the father for the figurative, emotional, and psychological maiming that he did of their family.
Yep.
So you wrote the story, you shared it with me, and the Chris's story Finboy is available on the show note website, breathingunderwater.us, and I urge you to read it because it's great. And it was my entry point. I as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but you know how sometimes you realize that you knew about something later, but you just weren't paying attention. I feel like I've heard of bands and I've heard of directors or whatever it is, like long before, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I guess.
Right.
But like I may have known about Selkies, but as far as I can remember consciously, I had never heard about shape shifting seal
Okay.
folklore in my life, and so your story was my entry point into this. And I remember I read it and I was floored and I loved it, and I really enjoyed it on its own
Yep.
merits. But I remember asking you, where did you get this folklore from? And you had sent me a website, which I think is still, and I'll put a link to that in the
Hmm.
Orkney Jar website. It's like the heritage site for the Orkney Islands.
Okay. Okay. It's still there. Wow.
Still there, yeah. You had sent me that, and then I read more about the Selkie lore in general, and so it was an interesting thing for me because I think a lot of people, and we'll get into this more as the podcast goes on, but I from what I understand, a lot of people are introduced to this folklore in the more traditional sense, and we've seen that in some of the more modern media that has come out over the years, like the Song of the Sea story, for instance, and stuff. It's more grounded in like traditional folklore.
Hmm.
And then it's like that's one of the facets of the Celtic folklore that um you dive deeper into, and then you learn about like the oral history and everything where it came from. But um I think it was kind of cool, and I'm sure this is true for people that like saw Ondine and that was their entry point into Selkies and stuff too.
The Colin Farrell, right?
Colin
Movie.
Farrell movie, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I have a feeling that if I had seen that in college, it probably would have had a similar effect. Just because you're like, I love that idea about modernized folklore and how things evolve, from something that's been around for thousands of years. But anyway, so I think that was one thing that really got my attention about it first was I never heard about this thing before,
Hmm.
and here it was presented to me in a modern sense, but I knew it was coming from something. It would have been like if your story had maybe contained mermaids or other kind of fairies or something, it would have found it interesting. But it was because it was a foreign a foreign concept of the Selkies for me, and because of its modern setting and the how relatable it all was. Especially we were young adults at the time, and we were still kind of coming into our own and figuring out our adult lives post grade school and everything. Like
Right.
it was very relatable kind of content. Um so we were sophomores or juniors, but I want to say we were juniors because I remember my junior year was when I had to start coming up with concepts for my senior material. So I had to pitch a screenplay. I had to pitch several screenplay ideas to my committee of professors, and then they would select what they thought was the strongest screenplay idea for my senior screenplay. And then I also had to similarly have an idea ready at the beginning of my senior year. So this was like the end of junior year, and over the summer was when you were supposed to be preparing for senior year because they got stuff started early at the nature of our school.
Hmm.
Um, and so I remember I pitched an idea for an adaptation, like a full length feature film based on your story, and then I also used that as a short film version too. And feature length screenplay was not accepted by the committee, and I ended up going with like
Ooh.
this This I know, right? But I, you know, unfortunately, like I didn't have a fully formed idea either. So I understand. I'm glad that it didn't happen at the time because I think it would have
To
been
be and
so.
to be fair, it's hard to stretch out a feature-length film from a maybe 7-page story with only 2.5
Sure.
characters.
Sure. However, I think your story is a great example of why short stories can be so powerful and profound because the short form nature of them is like a snapshot of a larger story a lot of
Yeah,
times, it's like there was a lot more backstory that happened before your story started, and
yeah,
I could see a whole, another section of the story happening afterwards. Yours was just like one little piece, but yeah, like, so I remember I read the story, and you sent me a link to the website, and I started doing my own research, and I don't know what happened in my brain, but like I was so hooked even back then. There was something different about it, and it's still kind of hard to articulate and put into like a like tangible this is why kind of words, but it
right.
really just like it became like an obsession. Like almost immediately I was like so fascinated with this this one. And I had read Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis and lots of fantasy, and I grew up in a household that was very much into sci-fi and fantasy, and but I never got super into dwarves or elves or orcs, or you know what I mean. Like there
Yeah,
was never I liked it all in the package that was presented by Tolkien or whatever, but I was never like, ooh, elves are so interesting to me that I'm going to go learn everything I can about elves and then integrate elves into my own. Selkies were that thing that for some reason it just became like this obsession that not only was I interested in it, but I wanted to contribute to it. And that's why, like, going into my senior year, after having done the research and read some books, and I think you and I probably discussed it some more, uh beyond the just the Finboy um side of things, then and I pitched those screenplays, and I had ideas, but my ideas were essentially adaptations of your story. So the short film that I will also put a link to the trailer that I made for it in the show notes it's an adaptation, which I took my own liberties for, but essentially it's the same
mm,
kind of structure and set up where there's a teenager, he's a high schooler that is getting ready to go off to college, and his hyper vigilant and and hyper hands-on controlling mother doesn't want him near. I i tried to I remember I went through several drafts, and I worked closely with my professors to help me refine it, because I think my original draft was almost like identical to yours, and the doing a lot of the stuff where, like, she would hide the dog dish at night or take water out
mhm.
of the plants. I love those visuals in my mind, but
It doesn't
um
quite translate.
yeah, well, I mean, I think it was to my professors. I don't know if I would agree now, but my professor, I think, felt it was a little over the top. They felt that it was ground, and I think it works great for your story because it shows how dedicated this mom was to her fear,
Mhm.
and how that manifests, and but for telling it as a story or as a visual thing, it was my version was, I think, more was too grounded for my professors to really understand the fantasy element. um and there's a whole nother side to that, because the film program at my school at the time was separate from the writing. They were in two different colleges. I think they've been consolidated now, but
Oh, okay.
the
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
university arts existed. It was a university that had three colleges: one in performing arts, fine arts, and media and communications. So the writing
Mhm.
side was in media and communications, but the film was in fine arts. So that the
Huh.
professors of film at the time were very much like abstract avant-garde kind of filmmakers.
Oh,
they
okay.
were not they were not as much interested in narrative structure and that kind of visualizing narrative as much as they were into like experimentation, which I respect and I think is valid. But it was interesting that that was the only film program that was available at the college. So when they created these minors for writing, well, for all students to take a minor in another program, because that hadn't been a thing until a couple of years after I got there. Basically, it was like a vertically siloed school where like you were in a major and you just focused on that, and it was really hard to take like a 6-hour painting studio class when you had like a 3-hour writing class at the same time. You know, like the
Oh,
school wasn't structured around integration at the time. I've heard that that's changed dramatically, but that's why like all of the writing kids that wanted to take the narrative video minor, which is what I ended up doing, because
mhm,
a cohort of us did that because we wanted to, you know, learn the film side of the technical film side of stuff to go along with our writing.
right.
And they didn't have anywhere for us to go except into the fine arts film program, which was not a narrative based program.
Hmm.
So all that said, the point is that like through influence by my, you know, my peers and professors, my adaptation, and you know, and my own sensibilities too, like it evolved from what the version of your story to mine, and it's like I said, it's the same general setup, but it plays out a little bit differently, where he's not cut off from water in general. He's not supposed to be around bodies of water because the
Right.
mother doesn't want him to abandon her like the father did, and she knows that if he goes to like a natural body of water and touches it or experiences it, then he'll like connect with his selkie side. And so she's very, you know, restricted. So of course, like being rebellious and everything, he does do that, and it triggers like this sense to like, you know, discover more about why he sees visions of like this man in the water and seals and stuff. And then yeah, and it ends pretty much the same way, except I don't have him going off for vengeance. I have him going off for, I mean, maybe like I don't, it's all implied. I have actually, I filmed two endings because I didn't know which one, you know, would be better. And the first ending was that he just disappears and the mom is sad, and that's the one I ended up going with,
Hmm.
the more open and implied ending. And then the other one was like he finds the dad and brings him back. So the mom's sitting at the riverside, and then you know, these two bodies emerge
Hmm.
and the family's reunited. So like
Hmm.
mine, you know, was a more, I guess, like optimistic take. But that one did not work on film because they were both, it was just weird, and it didn't fit the tone, but also it was so cold when we filmed it in Wissahickon Park outside of Philadelphia that,
Oh, yeah. Okay.
yeah.
I actually just
that
hiked there for the
Oh,
first
really?
time over a year ago now, but yeah,
That's
nice park.
awesome. Yeah, it is nice, isn't it?
Mm.
It was like it was my nice decompression place to when I needed to get out of the city, you know, and
Yeah.
go to nature. Went to Wissahickon, and but it was so cold. We filmed in like February, and it was supposed to be like,
Okay.
it was supposed to be towards the end of a school year, and the aesthetics don't work at all because there's like no leaves on the trees and everybody's wearing coats. But but my actors were, and this is all, you know, volunteer, like people were just trying to get their portfolios together. No, I wasn't paying anybody because I couldn't. But they they were so generous and gracious by like getting in the water, in frigid cold
Oh, yeah.
water. And I mean, they weren't like like swimming in it, but I had them like stand in it or splash a little bit. And
Hmm.
they were like, you could see their like bodies shaking and their
Oh,
teeth were
jeez.
chattering because they didn't have any like they didn't have their shirts on.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, this isn't going to work for the ending anyway. So it was all meant to be. But so yeah, I made that film, and during the time, you know, I just got deeper and deeper into Selkie lore, and just my general interest in it. And I think, you know, you and I have always kind of batted back and forth when we come across a good book or a movie, or even just like cute seal
As a
pictures like we
connection.
did
Right,
today.
right.
Yeah,
Still
like
videos.
over the years, like you and I have always kind of like kept our Selkie interest alive, you know, in exploring it with each other. And um, so that was like the beginning of it. I think that was sums up both of our journeys. And then where I want to get a little feedback from you too, but I'll say for my part, like where I went with it after college was, um, I just kept digging into it and discovering, you know, I discovered lots of different uh books, you know, like anthologies and collections of old like oral histories, and you know, and collections of tales from you know, different like fairy you know, I would often find most of the time
it was really hard to come by a book just about Selkies, but I would find a Selkie chapter or a Selkie story in another larger collection.
Right.
And that'll come down the road. But for now, I just like the next big thing for me was when I went to Ireland in 2008. I went there with an intention to find as many local, not U.S. published books as I could, and I ended up finding 13 books of everything from like children's, nighttime story books to collected anthologies. I don't think I found anything that was specifically a Selkie book except for the People of the Sea. I forget the author right now, but that was a book you had discovered first and recommended to me. And I found the European publication, and I remember that was the only like Selkie specific one that I brought home. But so then, I mean, that, and then as the years went on, I always had this inclination or this pull to go back to fleshing out. Like I never got to write that full screenplay, and I felt like my film was still kind of not complete in terms of its story. Like it was a short film that I would have loved to do more with. And I don't know, I just always had a pull to like just do something with it. And I would I would mess around every once in a while with like trying to develop story beats to like a bigger Selkie tale and stuff. I just never had the right inspiration and right spark to like make it into more than just sort of a retread of stuff that I already liked about the folklore.
Okay.
And then I moved to Maui, and I discovered something else that I'd never known about, which is the Hawaiian monk seal. And then I left Maui, and I was very distraught and angsty about that. And that was trauma and pain and suffering are what makes the best art, right?
Yeah. So they say, but always
but I channeled that into, because of all those pieces and all the research and all the experiences over the years, into a story that still doesn't have a home. It started out as a graphic novel that I was doing, that my brother Dave was illustrating, and I was writing a story. It got too big for its own for our own sustainable ability to continue that. And there is a link to the graphic novel called Kanaloa on the website breathingundderwater.us. I thought maybe I would write a book to encapsulate that story and to flesh it out. And that was what reaffirmed for me that I am just not a prose writer. It was like pulling teeth trying to get that thing. I got like 4 chapters written, and I hated every moment of it. It was so disappointing. I know. I was like, I just can't do this. I was just so like second guessing all of my language usage, and I felt so amateur, and I just was like, and it was I'm so visual about it that I just kept wanting to write it into a screenplay, which I did. I have a version of a screenplay written that isn't really what the story became, but it's I think I had shared that with you a long time ago, and because of your wisdom and experience as a writer, you helped not only like refine and make a better version of the story that I was trying to tell by asking me a simple question about it, but also spawned a second part to the story that I hadn't considered the first time. And you asked me about my antagonist, what makes him the hero of his own story? Because he was so one-dimensional and Voldemort-y, or Sauron-y or whatever. Like he was such a evil for evil's sake villain. And you asked me that question, and I said, yeah, what does make him the hero of his own? And then I was like, oh my God, I have a character here. And it became this whole bigger thing. So I want to get into all that down the road. But I'm curious though, if you've had any evolution of your Selkie interest post Finboy and post college and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, I think it was. I remember being very bowled over and honored when you said you wanted to make a short film out of it.
Oh,
out of the story. So thank you always for that.
Thank
But
you.
then I think the great thing too is honestly you've run way further with it as in like inspiration with selkies in general as an inspiration for the creative path than I did. And like honestly, I don't think I've maybe glanced at the story in the years since then, but I haven't done anything with it. I haven't expanded upon it. And aside from I think I shared like a poetry book, like the People of the Sea, and another
Yeah.
poetry book that I had found
Yeah, which is a
online. But since then, it's just kind of like gone a bit more kind of it's drifted into the background for me more.
okay.
But I think I mean, okay, it's cliche to say, but looking back, I can definitely see like the queer undertones to the original story. And if I did something with that, if I tried to read the story today, I might bring something in more with that.
Hmm.
Just and then just knowing like the history of Hans Christian Andersen, like
Hmm.
historians have said that he wrote the Little Mermaid over an unrequited male lover, and then you go
Heard
into
that.
like the popular um, image of like the Little Mermaid Disney movie, and you look at that as an adult, and that thing is just really
Hmm.
it's more transgressive, I think, than people give it credit for.
Sure. Absolutely.
And just even recently actually, though I work at a library now, and I was shelving in the juvenile section, and I came across this new juvenile nonfiction book. I think it's called The Mermaid Book or something like that, but it's this gorgeous large hardcover, and it's all of the different mermaids and mermaid adjacent stories and folklores from across the world. And of course, I flip UK, Scotland, and there's the Selkies. So they've got the Selkies, they've got the Rusalka in Russia, and
Mm-hmm.
various different either shapeshifters or water type spirits. So it's very nice.
So, and I just think that that's just really interesting. That, and I don't know. I love that idea. Like in hindsight, now that we're almost 20 years, removed from the inception
Mhm.
of this obsession, and it started with you, and it was passed to me, and my kids know about it. I've made them watch Song of the Sea, and I have a whole bookshelf, or yes, one of the shelves, not an entire bookshelf, um, of all my Selkie library, not to mention
Oh,
all the stuff
cool.
that I have, like backed up on hard drives and stuff. So
Mhm.
I'd like to think that this, and I think that this is more like indicative of why folklore is what it is and why it's so powerful,
Yeah.
is that yeah, like how it evolves with time and culture and personal experience, and how it's passed down through the ages and is like rediscovered and updated and all that kind of stuff. And that's really what I want this podcast to be, is not just selkies, but also the intersection between all of these things. And for me, it's just like an opportunity to kind of like not just tell my fictional story, which I'd like to get to down the road, but and have a place, to host and keep your story alive, but also just as a place to kind of have a home for this whole obsession with lore in general, and why it's, I don't know, so important and so powerful, and why I mean, I think what it really comes down to in general is stories. Storytelling is part of the human condition, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. And whatever the current technologies and media is, is a good modern example, but we've always told stories to each other. I think we always will, and I think that they're important, and we'll get into down the road why I think Selkie stories were important at the time. And I think there's been a lot of historians to identify like where these ideas came from, because of
Mhm.
people dealing with loss and shipwrecks, and the seafaring fishing culture, kind of how people, the sea can be very, very dangerous and unpredictable, and people would go out and not come home, and people would tell their children, and this is what I understand from things that I've read, but it makes a lot of sense. They, like, oh, your dad went back to be with the SEALs or something like that,
Mhm.
because and so that it's not just like, yeah, he's dead.
like a comfort.
Yeah. So, but it also, and that's why these stories are often, they deal with, and I think that's true in general. Like art is a way for us to express our feelings in general. But a lot of times the stuff that we really need to get out is the shadow things, as my brother would call them, the darkness, the hopelessness, the loss, the pain, the trauma. It's a healthy way to express those feelings, and I think that's why there's so much, because a lot of Selkie folklore tends to be pretty dark and tragic. However, it doesn't ever make me feel hopeless or dejected. I find it very, I don't know, inspiring, to think that there may be more. And I think that's why fantasy is also so powerful. To the idea that we know in our reality that, like, we convince ourselves that magic doesn't exist, but does it really not?
Right.
It exists in this story. Maybe it does, and we just haven't experienced it yet. I don't know.
You can tell and retell the stories, like you said, over the ages in different forms, whether it's oral history or song, or then someone writes it down and then they adapt it to a picture book, and then they adapt it into like an adult fantasy novel. And it's also just kind of like a reminder of our kind of entanglement with the natural world, where we want to be part of it, we want to be closer to it, but it's also, nature's dangerous and nature's unforgiving.
Yeah, it's like, it could be morality or lesson learning tales too. Oh, before I forget, I have one more like anecdote just to kind of bring this all together. I should have mentioned it earlier, but I think it's a good way to wrap things up today. Is just kind of validates that it's just one of those little moments that validates all these things, because over the years and as I've been into Selkie stuff, sometimes I'm like, is this just a waste of time, when I've wanted to tell my own stories and use this folklore in my own way? Like, I'm like, am I just appropriating like other people's stuff? Am I just ripping off? I have that, definitely. I've always had that imposter syndrome when it comes to my own expression of like, am I just emulating what I enjoy, what other people do? What do I really have to contribute? Do I have anything to contribute? Like, and that whole thing. This is one of those validating anecdotes for me. Was when I was making my senior film, and I wanted to have some authentic seal footage. And back in the day, this would have been 2005. Yeah, 2005, 2006. There were places that you could get stock footage from, but they all cost money. It wasn't like nowadays where you can just rip stuff off the internet, or even pay like a small subscription fee and get like thousands of like professionally filmed stock footage. Like, it's so readily available now. But back then, like I just didn't know how to get my hands on seal footage that wasn't copyrighted and something I could use in my movie. So I found out that the Camden, New Jersey aquarium, just right across the water from Philly, had a seal tank, and I went over there not really expecting too much. I just had hoped to film them a little bit, from the outside. So I went with a friend, and we got tickets and went in with my camera, and they were, very nice about letting me go in and like film stuff. And I got there, and I was filming just from the outside of the tank, and the seals were swimming around, and they were adorable and curious and amazing, like they always are. And the trainer, or their caretaker or whatever, their I don't know what the correct word is for that position, but the person that oversees and cares for the seals, came out and said, "Hey, you're filming something. Do you want to come into the enclosure so you can see them a little bit better?" I was like, "Oh my gosh, yes, thank you so much."
Awesome.
Yeah, and I went in there, and she was so nice, and then we were just chatting a little bit, and I told her about your story and why I was making this movie, and she said, "Oh, I have a dog named Selkie." And I was
Of
like,
course.
"There it is. Like,
Yep.
that's it. Like, I'm not alone in this. You and I are not alone in this thing, this obsession with this stuff." I don't know. So there you go. Chris, I appreciate your time so much. When we have stuff to discuss, we shall do it. And other times, I think I'll be going solo and just talking about some of the other stuff that's on my mind, and we'll just see how this thing evolves. But thank you for being part of it, and thank you for the whole reason that I'm even here talking to you about it.
Yeah, I'd be glad to come back whenever. It's good
Awesome.
to reminisce on this.
Thank you so much for listening, following, and being part of this journey, this obsession. There's a lot more to come. You can find all the different ways to follow and interact with this show at breathingunderwater.us. Be sure to visit breathingunderwater.us. Follow me on Instagram at breathingunderwater1 and drop me a line at breathingunderwater1@gmail.com. Please note that I do not claim any ownership of any media presented in this podcast, which is only used for promotional purposes unless otherwise noted, and all views and opinions are those of the person expressing them and do not represent any other entities discussed in this podcast.